A chance encounter on a cold, desolate night leads Lucas to a farm on the brink of collapse, and into the life of a woman carrying the weight of her family's legacy. As old wounds resurface and long-held secrets begin to unravel, Lucas must prove that it's never too late to rebuild what's broken, not just the farm, but the trust between them. Will they heal together, or will their pasts pull them apart forever? The cold night wind blew fiercely, forcing Lucas Grant to zip up his jacket as he stepped out of the car. His vehicle, stranded in the middle of the empty road, seemed to have given up on the journey, just like him. The distant lights of the farmhouse shone like a beacon of hope in the darkness, and he knew that was his only chance for shelter that night. His shoes sank into the wet soil as he walked toward the farmhouse. The path seemed longer than it had first appeared, and the feeling of being watched by the vast dark sky grew stronger with each step. He had something urgent on his mind, but the truth was that the years of success and ambition hadn't filled the emptiness inside him. He tried to push the thought away, focusing only on the fact that he needed help. When he reached the door, he hesitated before knocking. A strange sensation washed over him, something beyond the discomfort of being a stranger asking for help. He knocked softly. Nothing. He waited a few seconds before knocking again, this time harder. Footsteps echoed from the other side, followed by the creaking of the wood. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman with a hard, cautious gaze, but a curious warmth. Claire, he thought, recognizing immediately the posture of someone not used to dealing with strangers. She held the door with one hand, partially blocking the entrance, her eyes narrowing as she assessed Lucas. "Who are you?" she asked without preamble. Lucas took off his hat, a respectful gesture, but it didn't seem to impress her. "My car broke down a few miles from here," he explained, pointing to the road behind him. "I have no signal and no place to stay the night. I thought maybe you could help me." Claire frowned, clearly distrustful. A woman living alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere couldn't afford to trust easily. Yet there was something in Lucas's demeanor, perhaps the weariness in his eyes, that made her hesitate. "Are you alone?" she asked, still cautious. Lucas nodded. "Yes, just me. I don't mean to bother you, just need a place to stay until morning." She thought for a moment, the silence between them growing heavy. Finally she sighed. "I have a room outside in the barn. It's simple, but it's safe. You can spend the night there." Relief washed over him, and he forced a smile, not wanting to seem too desperate. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Claire opened the door wider, but still didn't let him fully enter. "Come in for a bit. It's cold outside. I'll get the room ready, but you can have some coffee while you wait." Lucas accepted the invitation and stepped inside. The interior was warm, with a simplicity that spoke of the harshness of life in the countryside. The furniture was old but well kept. In the living room, a worn leather sofa and a small shelf with a few books occupied the space. There was something familiar about the atmosphere, and then he saw it. In the corner of the room, illuminated by a soft lamp, stood a sculpture, a marble piece that Lucas recognized instantly. His heart skipped a beat. That sculpture, he would know it anywhere. It was a work by Isabel, the woman he had loved more than 20 years ago. The world around him seemed to freeze as his past came rushing back with overwhelming force. He couldn't take his eyes off the sculpture, each detail bringing back memories he had long tried to bury. Claire entered the room with 2 cups of coffee and noticed Lucas's fixed gaze on the sculpture. "That piece is impressive," he commented, trying to hide the emotional impact. "Did your mother make it?" Claire set the cups down on the table and nodded without taking her eyes off him. "Yes, my mother was an artist. She made several sculptures before moving here." The weight of her words hit Lucas like a shock. Isabel, the woman he had loved and left, was Claire's mother. How had he never known? His mind raced with questions, but he knew he couldn't reveal everything just yet. "Your mother, she lived in Europe before coming here, didn't she?" Lucas asked. Claire frowned, clearly suspicious. "Yes. She didn't talk much about that part of her life." "Why do you ask?" Lucas looked back at the sculpture, feeling a knot tighten in his throat. I think I knew your mother many years ago, he said, the words weighing down like lead. I lived in Europe for a while, and I met an artist named Isabel. We fell in love. Claire stood still, her gaze fixed on Lucas. There was something different in her posture now, as if she were trying to piece together the truth. My mother never mentioned you, she said slowly. Lucas felt the weight of those words, but he knew there was more to come. Claire stood motionless for a long moment, the silence in the room becoming unbearable. He knew he should have measured his words more carefully. Revealing such a deep and unexpected connection without preparation was risky. He didn't know the woman standing before him, and she had no reason to trust a stranger who showed up in the middle of the night. My mother knew you, Claire repeated, trying to process the information. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. Yes, a long time ago. When I was living in Europe, I didn't know. He paused, carefully choosing his next words. I didn't know she had a daughter. Claire's brow furrowed in confusion. She never mentioned anyone named Lucas, she said, her voice cold. And my mother wasn't the type to leave someone behind, especially if they were important to her. Her words cut deep. Lucas knew he deserved her distrust. He had left Isabel, even though it wasn't intentional. She had never told him she was pregnant. If he had known... He shook his head, trying to push away the what-ifs. Your mother never told me she was pregnant, he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with regret. If I had known, I would have come back. Claire studied him, her arms crossed defensively. She never talked about you, she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. And I don't think she ever would have. If you were so important, why weren't you here? Lucas winced at the sharpness of her tone. He knew he didn't have a defense. He wasn't there when Isabel needed him most, and that was a truth he couldn't escape. I didn't know, he repeated softly. I didn't know she had a child. Claire's expression hardened and she turned her back to him, looking out the window at the vast, isolated landscape. My mother moved here when I was young, she said, her voice distant. It was always just the two of us. I grew up believing my father was someone who couldn't stay, but she never told me who he was or why he left. She turned to face him again, her eyes fierce. Maybe she knew you weren't worth mentioning. The final blow. Lucas felt the guilt tighten in his chest. He had no idea how to make this right, but he knew that walking away now would be even worse. I didn't know. I didn't know, Claire, he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. If I had known... But you didn't, she cut him off, turning away again. And she's gone now. There's nothing you can do to change that. The room fell silent once more, except for the soft sound of the wind outside. Lucas felt the weight of years of regret bearing down on him. How could he begin to make amends for not being there when Isabel needed him the most? And now her daughter, his daughter, looked at him as if he were a stranger who had never cared. Look, I'll show you the room where you'll sleep tonight, Claire said abruptly, clearly eager to end the conversation. Tomorrow morning you can find someone to help with your car. I think it's best if you leave. She moved quickly, grabbing a lantern and opening the door to the outside. The cold air hit them both as they stepped out into the night. The farm seemed even more isolated in the dark, with only the sounds of the wind and the distant cries of animals breaking the stillness. Claire led Lucas to a small shed near the barn, a modest structure but adequate for a night's stay. She unlocked the door and switched on a dim light. Inside, the room was simple, with just a bed, a chair, and a small wooden table holding a pitcher of water. It's not much, but it's safe, she said, her tone devoid of warmth. You can sleep here. Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of the day's revelations pressing down on him. He wanted to say something, anything, to make things better, but he knew that no words could fix this. Not now. She handed him the key to the door, avoiding his gaze. Lock the door when you're done, she said. I don't like to leave anything open at night. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing into the darkness. Lucas stood there for a moment, watching her silhouette fade into the night before stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. Lucas sat on the edge of the simple bed, the weight of his own thoughts pressing heavily on him. The sound of the wind outside, mixed with the distant cry of an animal, filled the room with an eerie sense of isolation. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite being surrounded by nature's beauty, he was more alone than ever before. The space around him seemed to mirror the emptiness he had been carrying for so long. His mind kept drifting back to Isabel, to the love they had shared, and to the daughter he had never known. The night dragged on. Sleep came in restless fragments, each moment filled with flashes of memory. Isabel's face, the laughter they had shared, the sculpture that stood in Claire's living room. That piece, so familiar, was now a symbol of everything Lucas had lost. But it was also a reminder that, despite the passage of time and the distance between them, something of his past still remained in the world. As the first light of dawn crept through the small window, Lucas rose from the bed, feeling the weight of the sleepless night in his bones. The air outside was crisp, the land bathed in the soft golden light of early morning. The farm, though worn and struggling, looked peaceful, almost untouched by the storm of emotions that had swept through the night before. But Lucas knew that things couldn't remain as they were. The farm, and more importantly, his relationship with Claire, were at a breaking point. Stepping outside, Lucas made his way toward the main house. As he walked, he noticed Claire already out in the yard, tending to the horses. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as though she were fighting to maintain control of everything around her. But there was something in the way she moved that spoke of exhaustion, an exhaustion that even her steely demeanor couldn't hide. For a moment, Lucas hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. So much had been left unsaid between them. And yet there was no more time for silence. He finally spoke, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to talk." Claire glanced up, her expression unreadable, and continued, brushing down one of the horses. "About what?" Her tone was sharp, but there was an underlying weariness to it that Lucas couldn't ignore. "The future," Lucas said, "of this farm. You can't keep running it like this alone. It's too much." Claire didn't stop what she was doing, but her jaw tightened and her body tensed. "I've been doing just fine without your help," she replied, her voice cold. "You've been doing everything you can," Lucas countered, taking a few steps closer, though not too close. He had learned from the night before that pushing her too hard would only drive her away. "But it's not enough. You can't do this alone anymore, Claire." The words hung in the air between them. Claire set down the brush and turned to face him fully, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face for some sign of insincerity. "What's your point?" she asked, her voice heavy with suspicion. "My point is," Lucas said slowly, "I've been working behind the scenes. I've set up an emergency fund to help the farm. It's not a permanent solution, but it'll cover the debts and buy us time to rebuild." Claire's eyes went wide in disbelief, and she took a step back. "You did what?" she asked, her voice low, controlled, but the anger simmering beneath was palpable. "I didn't want to interfere," Lucas said quickly. "I thought you'd refuse, but this place, it can't survive like this. It needs more than just you." Claire's hands clenched at her sides, her breath shallow. "And you think that's what I need? More money, more handouts?" Her voice was rising now, her frustration clearly evident. "I've spent my whole life making sure I didn't need anyone. And now you show up thinking you can fix everything with a check?" Lucas held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not trying to fix everything, Claire. I'm just trying to help. I know this isn't what you want, but I also know what's at stake here. Your mother built this farm from nothing. I'm not here to take it away from you. I'm here to help you save it." Claire's face softened for a brief moment, but the walls she had built around herself were still very much intact. "You don't understand," she said, her voice quieter now. "This place, my mother's legacy, it's all I have left. I'm not going to let you come in here and take control." "I'm not trying to take control," Lucas insisted. I'm trying to make sure that your mother's legacy doesn't disappear because you're trying to carry it alone. You can't do this by yourself, Claire." The silence between them stretched out, the tension palpable. Finally Claire sighed and looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the farm stretched out before them. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Lucas stepped closer, but he kept his distance, understanding her need for space. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said softly. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here for as long as it takes, Claire." For the first time since their conversation began, she looked at him, not with anger, but with something else. A mixture of exhaustion and maybe, just maybe, a hint of hope. She didn't say anything, but in that silence Lucas knew that he had finally broken through. Days passed, and the tension between Lucas and Claire slowly began to ease. The emergency fund had helped, just as Lucas had promised, but there was more work to be done. They spent their days fixing fences, repairing buildings and tending to the crops. The progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. Claire had allowed Lucas to stay, but they had yet to truly bridge the gap that existed between them. The walls were still there, but at least now they were working together to tear them down. One evening, as they stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Claire finally spoke. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "My mother always wanted this place to last. She wanted it to be a legacy. I don't think she ever imagined I'd be here alone, trying to keep it all together." Lucas turned to her, his heart aching with the weight of her words. "I think she would have wanted you to have help," he said gently. "She would have wanted you to have someone by your side." Claire met his gaze, and for the first time there was no anger or defensiveness in her eyes, just a flicker of something softer. "Maybe," she whispered, "but I don't know if I'm ready to trust you completely. I don't know if I can let go of everything I've worked for." "You don't have to trust me all at once," Lucas said, his voice firm yet gentle. "But I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Claire nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, Lucas felt like they were moving forward. Together. As the days passed, they continued to work side by side, the farm slowly beginning to recover. The crops grew stronger, the fences were repaired, and the sense of hope that had long been absent from Claire's life slowly returned. There was still much to be done, but for the first time the future didn't seem so uncertain. And one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, Claire finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for not giving up on me. On us." Lucas smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I never will."